Hey everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Speak Plainly podcast, where we speak plainly about things that matter. I am your host, Owl Medicine, and in today's podcast, we're going to be talking about guilt versus shame. Guilt and shame, for a lot of us, they feel like the same thing. And I want to take a minute right off the gate to say, I'm sorry I've been gone for so long. I know, I really am sorry I've been gone for so long. I want to put these out as regularly as I can, and I honestly just needed a break from everything. I wound up stressing 4 of my relationships, count them 4, over the last 6 weeks by my overanalyzation of everything. I did a good job, analyzed well and all of that, but I would have done much better to just not overanalyze everything and wind up stressing those relationships. So I decided I needed to kind of chill for a bit. Now we're back. And I think this is the perfect topic to get back into the end of this season before we start next season, season 2 of the Speak Plainly podcast in 2023. Coming back from the long break that I've been on, guilt versus shame is one of my favorite things to talk about because it's such a subtle concept. And the issue with subtle concepts is when we think we know them, we make a lot of wrong assumptions and they get us into trouble. So starting off, let me just say, if you haven't heard of Brené Brown, now you have. Google her. At least go look up her TED Talk, her first TED Talk especially. Either one of them. The first one went more viral than the second one did. But her TED Talks are about, it was the power of vulnerability. The second one that she did that didn't go quite as viral had the word shame in the title. And she says that that is the number one reason it just didn't get as popular, as people are ashamed of shame. Okay, well, if we're going to get into it, let's get into it. So what exactly is guilt and shame? That's what we're going to be talking about today. Are they the same thing? Where do they originate from? What is the purpose of guilt and what is the purpose of shame? And does guilt or shame, either one or both, affect us in our normal, everyday lives? Well, the first thing is they're both emotions, right? That's pretty simple. Duh. They're both emotions. But I am interested in understanding things from a first-person perspective. I try to look at third-party, objective, scientific perspectives and then kind of correlate that with my own internal experiences. And when it comes down to guilt and shame, we have to set up definitions really early on. So bear with me. I know that's not really fun, but when something is well defined, it's much easier to conceptualize and therefore talk about and think about rationally later on. So where all emotions start is a physiological sensation in the body. You've probably heard me say that before. The beginning of every emotion is a sensation or a somatic experience. That sensation can be pleasant or unpleasant, and at first that's kind of all we have to go on. When we have very small children, we get to witness those small children experience emotions without the ability to talk or describe what is happening inside them. They can't call it anger yet, so what is it? It's just a sensation that's inside them, and it's uncomfortable. At least anger usually is. So how do we learn to differentiate emotions? Well, we learn to identify and differentiate emotions through our parents modeling it for us, and that's going to become super important later. But say a kid gets mad because they want a candy bar and you say no, so they are mad. But the child doesn't know quite what mad is. So you have to sit and explain it to them. The conversation goes something like, oh, I see that you're having really big emotions right now. Are you upset that mommy didn't give you a candy bar even though you really wanted the candy bar? And the kid nods, and the anger will probably go down a notch, maybe, on intensity levels. Maybe followed up with, I see that you're upset, and that's understandable. Candy bars taste really good, don't they? The candy bars will also make you feel sick if you eat it right now. And that's why mommy's not going to give you the candy bar. So in this moment, what's happening with the child is learning to identify the sensations inside them, what they're called, and where they come from, where they originate. So I actually recently just learned that the pain systems in the body, the pain circuits in the body, are pretty much fully developed. The limbic system in the body is pretty much fully developed when you're born. But the amygdala, which is like that threat response center, isn't. It's underdeveloped compared to pain and the limbic system. So we experience emotions and pain before we are able to comprehend where they come from and why, which is why these things are not innate. We don't just understand them. That's why we have to have parents modeling these things for us. So this example is a great example because it's picture perfect, because I was able to just make it up and have an entirely fictional mom and child. And if a kid's screaming about a candy bar, you've had the pain conversation before. But it's a perfectly fine teaching tool. This is how all humans learn to name and cope with emotions. First, we learn to name the emotion. That takes it down a notch. That's the whole name it to tame it concept of emotion regulation. Not knowing what a sensation is can be really, really scary. Naming that fear takes away some of that. And we're talking about guilt and shame, but first we have to establish emotions, because guilt and shame are an emotion, and how we conceptualize them so we can understand the difference between guilt and shame. So it's advantageous to name an emotion as fast as we possibly can, because that's going to automatically take down our intensity level a notch. The fastest way to do something is subconsciously. So we begin to name our sensations subconsciously once we do have names for them. Like once we learn them, most of that is happening subconsciously. And that's really, really important. Remember this, because as I've talked with folks about guilt versus shame and asking my friends and stuff about how they separate them, most people don't. Many people, even well-informed, psychologically bent people with a psychological bent to their personality or to their specialization, still, some of those people haven't separated guilt and shame, and it's because they get lumped together so often. And when we say, "Oh, guilt or shame," it's like we're saying that the two are the same, but they're really not. So remember that when they come together like that, we'll think that they're the same, and we process things fastest subconsciously. So we try to name stuff subconsciously. So it actually makes sense that my friends and folks haven't really differentiated the two. Since shame and guilt are experienced as more or less the same thing for the first part of our lives, let's start the conversation with a story, one that allows us to distinguish between guilt and shame. One place where guilt and shame overlap a lot for a lot of people, especially at first, is sex. Let's use this as a way to differentiate the two things into clear categories. None of the science matters until it's applied to a person's life, so let's make this a personal story. Say you want to try something sexual that might be considered shameful to some other people. Say it's butt sex. You're guy, girl, hetero, gay, trans, middle, whatever. Don't care. You want to try butt sex. So, and you want to try it for the first time, you've been with your partner for a few years now, and you feel pretty comfortable asking for most things. Maybe not butt sex, but you're comfortable asking for other things, the remote or extra covers, or leave them to like leave you the hell alone. But you're fairly comfortable. So when you first consider approaching the subject with your partner in your head, before you ever approach them, you've probably already had lots of thoughts and lots of feelings about the act, about approaching it, about the conversation. You've probably already wondered if you're going to like it, if they're going to like it, what they might think of you because of your request, and probably even what you'll think of yourself if you actually like it. If it turns out that you like it, what are you going to think of yourself? You want to do it. You want to engage in this. You want to try the butt sex stuff. But you have this vague, weird feeling that holds you back just a little. What is that? Is that guilt or shame? How can you tell? If there's something holding back a partner in this story, from the moment that they first had the thought that butt stuff might be fun, to the time that they actually ask their partner to try it, that length of time is usually directly proportional to the amount of guilt or shame a person has. But which is it? Is it guilt or is it shame? And this is why I'm using sex, because sex is a great place to dissect the differences, because it shows us how we can start to differentiate the two. So here's Brené Brown's definitions, and I'm going to paraphrase here. When a person experiences guilt, the takeaway message from the guilt is that they did a bad thing. When a person experiences shame, the takeaway from shame, the message of shame, is I am bad. So guilt and shame, though they come hand in hand, part and parcel, are not the same. And one of them is very useful, and the other one is very, very problematic. Guilt says, I did bad. Shame says, I am bad. So that's the difference between guilt and shame. When you experience something and you're not sure what's happening, but you feel kind of icky, if the end result is that you feel bad about what you did, that's guilt. If you feel bad about who you are because of what you did, that's shame. So back to another story. Sex is the perfect example because as a kid, one, hopefully you aren't having much sex, and two, you have no idea who you are or what you like yet as a kid. You're meant to be exploring and learning at that time. And in the grand scale of things, it's my philosophy that until about the age of 30, the job of every human is FAFO, or fuck around and find out, baby. FAFO is meant to help you figure out who you are. But why is figuring out who you are so important, and what does it have to do with guilt and shame? Well, see, according to Brené Brown, and I have to agree, shame always has social and cultural roots or connotations. Which is why shame feels so utterly damning. That's why public shaming works. You can guilt a friend into doing something, but public shaming is a whole nother level, isn't it? Guilt says I did a bad thing, where shame says I am bad, which makes only one of these things useful: guilt. Shame is a useless emotion. It is a paralyzing emotion. It provides no usable feedback. You remember in school being taught about providing constructive criticism? Constructive criticism is a criticism of an action or a behavior that is actionable for the receiver. You suck isn't constructive criticism. There is no way to correct or improve a behavior from the info included in that feedback. It just says, you suck. So see, that's shame. You did this, so you suck. You did this, that's a bad move, is guilt. You did this, so you suck, is shame. Whereas something like, you failed to close on time and you didn't wipe down properly, so in the morning shift had to pick up your slack. That's constructive criticism, because in it is the information to construct a better way of accomplishing the same task later on down the road. So guilt is constructive. Shame is destructive. It is always always, always destructive. It is destructive by nature. What's horrendous is that we use it all the fucking time in our society. We beat it into our children one way or another in an effort to make them good citizens. And this is what I mean about kids early in life not having any difference between guilt and shame. Most of what our parents are trying to instill in us is how to be a good person, and part of being a good person is being a good citizen, being a good social citizen. And unless you have really awesome parents who sit down and say, I love you and you're great and you're wonderful, but you did a bad thing, from a lot of us, guilt and shame in early life is the same thing. Because we're so self-absorbed as children that whatever we do, if we do something that's bad, it is easier to assume that we are bad because everything's about us. And we don't exactly have like executive functioning yet, so it's hard to think our way out of that. Like excitement and stress, the only biological difference between experiencing one over the other is whether or not you want the stress. Let me say that again in a different way. Excitement, the experience of being excited about something, and the experience of being stressed about something under an fMRI is identical. They're pretty much identical. The only difference between stress that you don't like and excitement that you do like is literally whether or not you want that stress. If you want that stress, then you're excited about it. If you don't want that stress, then it's just stress. So we all choose whether the discomfort that we feel is a result of something that we did and therefore have control over, or if it's fundamentally about who we are, for which obviously there is no recourse. So when I say choose, I mean it. You choose. The average adult makes 30,000 decisions a day. Most of them automated, obviously. How many decisions are you conscious of that you make in a day? Probably not 30,000. I'm definitely not conscious of 30, probably. So until this process of separating guilt and shame is brought to the conscious from the subconscious, we're going to struggle. Many of us were raised in America, like I was, where we have a very puritanical culture. We have a religious-based culture, and the religion that I was raised with is definitely one riddled with shame. You were born a sinner, and only God can save you. And even if you're not really raised that way, as far as your religion, that's still such a real part of our culture. So most of us are predispositioned to shame because only a terrible person would do blah, blah, blah. Or you would have to be a blank in order to do blah, blah, blah. All of that is shame. All of it. I really want you to sit with that for a second, that any time that you say anybody who does blah, blah, blah is a blah, 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 or that makes you a blah, blah, blah. Anytime that you equate an action with value of the person, you're walking in shame. Anytime that some phrase falls out of your mouth where you say, only a blank would do blank, that's shame. Anytime that an action equates to a character flaw or a character trait, that's shame. And none of it's useful. None of it. So back to our story. When we do finally ask our partner to entertain our taboo desires and say that they agree, what happens if it turns out that our partner doesn't like the thing that we wanted? We may likely feel guilt or shame, which, remember, is just discomfort at first until it's differentiated, because these are sensations that happen, and the fastest way to name something is to name it subconsciously, and most of that happens behind the scenes, and we're just like, oh, it's this weird, yucky, guilty shame thing. So we might feel guilt or shame just for asking for something that our partner didn't enjoy. then the programming kicks in. And if you're raised like me, that was kind of religious or very religious like me, then you're programmed to blame your character. That's pretty much what I do and did anyway. You blame your character. You go, oh, I shouldn't have done that. I'm a blah, blah, blah. And that's not functional. If you blame something else, that's fine. That is guilt. Like, oh, okay, well, I tried it. You didn't like it. Okay, done. Like, guilt. There's some guilt there, and that's fine. It's like that you can feel guilty that you asked your partner and your partner willingly entertained something that they may or may not have wanted to do just to appease you, and they didn't like it, and turns out you didn't even like it. But if your takeaway from that experience is, I'm a dirty whore, that's shame, and that's useless. That's not functional. But if your takeaway from that is, well, I tried something, and turns out I didn't like it, that's guilt and functional. So where does that guilt or shame come from? Well, like I said, there's a social context to all of it, and a lot of it's cultural, right? So as far as I can tell with my religious studies, a lot of it, like a lot of the like no butt sex stuff, a lot of the like no having sex with women on their period, a lot of it's just really simple, like we need babies. Like it's just advice to like keep having babies. That's really what it was. Even when you go back into Levitical law and the not eating of unclean meat, and that there was lots of parasites and things that were in pork, and if you have sex with a woman on her period, she can't really get pregnant. And if you have butt sex, you can't get pregnant. And the whole thing was like, you need babies. So a lot of that makes sense, to me at least. But the theme is there. The theme is that liking butt sex is only for gays and prostitutes. And if you're not gay and you're not a prostitute, then that judgment from the arbitrary society, the invisible society that lives inside each of our heads, that pulls us into shame. For a shame-prone person, there is almost no way for this situation to not end in them feeling ashamed of themselves and their desires. The refusing partner, in this instance, probably doesn't even know yet if they like it or not. If they haven't actually tried to find out for themselves whether they like a thing or not, they're simply using the cultural norms as their guide for what's appropriate and acceptable. Remember how I said shame always has a social component? There it is. You want shame? Because this is how you get shame. If you were to take a poll of the entire country and you have everyone in the country write out the top 50 things they feel guilty about, it stands to reason that many of those might be alive and well in our culture in the forms of social expectations, customs, and even some laws. Things that people might feel guilty about are murdering or robbing people or raping people or like stealing food, that sort of thing. So in this way, guilt is meant to guide a person to live a life according to their own personal values. But all those things I just listed are also socially important, right? So I do see where shame is coming from. I see that it like, from a social perspective, it is a way for the people at large to control the individuals of a culture. Shameful things, not always, but do often have a weird societal rationality if you take wide enough view. Like I said, don't murder, rob, rape, steal, that sort of thing. Meanwhile, butt sex, for example, feels amazing, especially if you have a prostate. If you haven't tried it, then you might. You probably should. I mean, I'm biased twice over, having a prostate and all, but still, the act doesn't serve anyone but the people who are experiencing the pleasure of committing such a shameful act. Even the term shameful acts, we have these shameful acts. There are certain things that we've just decided that if a person does this, they have no value. That's fucked. Because we also know that there is no action or behavior on the planet that is not okay under certain circumstances, whether that be murder or theft It doesn't matter. The only reason it's considered shameful in a society is because it goes against that society's goals. In the same way that if we feel guilty about something, it's because we did something, and then the result of that pulled us further away from our own personal goals and personal values. The same thing is true for society and shame. In this case, put simply, butt sex doesn't make babies. And the babies of any future civilization are its society, so as a society, we need babies. Our culture and societies have a goal of continued existence. We need babies in order for that to happen, which means butt sex is taboo to society because it conflicts with the interests of that society, not because it's inherently wrong. Which means unless the continuation of the species is the only reason that you ever have had or want to have sex again, it being shameful to society has jack shit to do with you. Because your goals are different. And that's a big piece to recognize. Society's goals and your goals will overlap in some cases and will not in others, which means in order to get good at differentiating shame from guilt, and then to choose guilt, one must know what their own goals are. If you have no personal goals, you will be conscripted into somebody else's goals, primarily society's goals, which means you will also be conscripted into shame. It can leave a person who isn't built to fit into society riddled with shame if they don't have their own goals well defined. That's like, it's a fine life if that's what you want, to like pass that buck and live through somebody else's thing, especially if you're not a shame-prone person. Go for it. Do you, boo-boo. That's not for me. But it does work for some. And I think this is what makes telling the difference between guilt and shame super duper duper hard for the first like third of life, especially. If I've said it once, I've said it 1,000 times. No one is capable of making a decision on their own until at least the age of 30, probably 35. I'm not even 35 yet. But much of the reason behind this is the depth and the power of social conditioning in our biology. The way we are conditioned is incredibly thorough. You and I were raised in a specific culture. Even if our cultures are not exactly the same, many things will overlap because capitalism and agriculture has unified nearly the entire species into one giant cultural umbrella. Even so, you and I were not born knowing what we like or what we want. On day one of life, I wasn't contemplating the Shang cycle of five-element theory or the kinesthetic chain, which are now as much a part of me as the back of my hand. It took time, it took exposure and exploration in order to find the things that I love and learn to love them and use them well. The same goes for everything else that you do in life. As children, we're presented with this view of the world that things are right and wrong. The things that are supposedly right or wrong, sometimes even our parents tell us are a little bit screwy. But because belonging is so important to children and to adults, our adult parents tell us what is right and what is wrong based off of their own understanding of the culture and that they live in and their own value system, which is also predicated, in part at least, on belonging. Since for humans, belonging to a group comes part and parcel with survival. With food, safety, and shelter, you need to belong. That's the way our species has always done things. We aren't snakes. We're not reptilian. We're not cold-blooded. I said earlier, when we're young, guilt and shame are nearly the same experience internally, and it takes time and repeated attempts to figure out what is a social construct that you've been held to and what is, in fact, a personal preference. And each differentiation is a choice. It's a decision to dive into that vague discomfort and see what is guilt, which provides personal feedback about our own nature and goals, and what is shame, which is fucking useless. So, another story. I have a friend who had a sexual experience recently where they tried something new, and it wasn't long into that before they realized that it was not a thing that they enjoyed. There was a lot of other pieces to the story, but for brevity and anonymity's sake, I will leave it at that. because of their social conditioning combined with some previous sexual trauma, they were stuck in this horrible state of feeling like they had been taken advantage of yet again. Then the questions rolled in. Why did I do this? Why did he do that? Was I taken advantage of or was I not? Did I ask for this? Was I manipulated? And all of these questions and a billion more compounded and flew through their head faster and faster and faster, partially because of the past trauma and partially from shame conditioning. It was a seriously disturbing moment for my friend that took a little while to put into perspective. Once the event was put into perspective, which was only able to happen after conversations with friends, loved ones, and therapists, they realized that turns out they were just fine. They realized that they wanted to try something new and they didn't like it. There were lots of other weird things that happened that day that distracted originally, but they realized that it's their story and they get to live their story the way that they want, and they get to take away from the event a story of their own choosing. And that's the empowerment in this podcast today. That's the empowerment. What my friend did here was, in a very dysregulated state, reached out for help, found other people that they knew could sit with them in this darkness and in this confusion and go, what happened? What actually happened? And it turns out for them, when they called me first seemed like a very uncomfortable situation. By the time the conversation was over, and I'm not the only person that they had this conversation with, but by the time the conversation was over, they were like, yeah, you know what? I wanted something new. I tried something new with somebody I thought that I could do that with. Turns out I didn't like it. And that's fine. The end. Full stop. And this is from somebody who has some trauma in their past, including sexual traumas. And they had a moment here where they could have gone either way, but they made a choice to dive into that discomfort of that physiological sensation that is the beginning of every emotion and make a decision to choose one or the other. And I'm happy to say my friend chose guilt. Now they have no shame or guilt about their taboo act. They decided that it was a thing that they tried, and then they're like, all right, and I'm done. That's super important. Most people I talk to about this can't tell for themselves which one they're feeling, guilt or shame. Because like I said, for the first 30 years of life, it's largely the same, I think. And everybody's different, right? But because our instincts are based on good and bad, because that's the world that we were raised in, learning to tell when we are in shame is an incredibly important piece of self-control and distress tolerance. What my friend did in this instance was a perfect example of FAFO, leading to self-exploration, and self-exploration leads to good decisions. After those decisions, sometimes the result is pleasant to experience, and we call those good ideas, while the result of other decisions lead to unpleasant experiences, and then we deem those bad. Both being deemed good or bad, retrospectively. But in the moment, there's no way of telling if something is a good idea or bad idea. So we have to make the decision, which means paying an unknowable price for that decision, because we're only going to be able to tell afterwards if it was good or if it was bad. And we all know using good and bad is a useless thing, but that's the way we're all trained. So we all do it, whether we like it or not. Myself very much included. In this case, the price for my friend was many small things, not the least of which was getting dysregulated and then swimming around in a sea of sorrow and discomfort, for like a day or two, I think, trying to figure out whether they were in shame or not. They didn't see it this way at the time, but essentially that's what they were doing, was trying to decide if they were bad or if what they did was bad, or what the sexual partner did was bad. The only way to make that decision is to choose a narrative in the moment, which is why it can be so helpful to call a friend who can hold up a compassionate narrative for us when we are dysregulated, and we can claim that narrative on our own for ourselves. that strengthens the bond between friends while simultaneously preventing the event from becoming traumatizing. Because remember, trauma isn't what happens to us. It's the story that we tell ourselves about what happens. All right. One last, even more controversial story. This is really heavy, and includes more adult themes. The first adult theme was kind of a joke. This is not a joking adult theme. So this next section, it will cover pedophilia, an article that was written on pedophilia, and some conversation about it. So if that's not a thing that you can listen to, then I'll see you at the next podcast. If you want to stay and listen, there's something here that should be discussed. So I've had this conversation recently with a couple of friends about a self-proclaimed pedophile. He wrote an article entitled, if I remember correctly, "I'm a pedophile, not a monster," or something to that effect. Essentially, the article is a first-person account of him saying, "I am sexually attracted to children, and I would rather die than give in to those desires." When he wrote this article, it became very obvious as I was reading it that he understands that he is a pedophile. He understands and recognizes how wrong that is, and how wrong it is or would be for a grown man to have sexual intercourse with a young person. He said he will never, ever allow himself in his life to act on that desire. But he recognizes that inside him is this desire. I'm sure you're probably having lots of feelings about this if you haven't already heard of this article. But the point that I would like to make, if you want to read the article, go read the article. I'm a pedophile, not a monster. This article, the reason I found it so beautiful those years ago when I first read it, is because this is guilt at work. This is guilt. If this was shame, we'd be having a very different conversation. This is guilt. This is an impressive amount of guilt. Because in this situation, shame says that you are bad if you do this thing. If the author of that article, this admitted pedophile, was only operating out of shame, which we established has very strong cultural, societal, social pressures and influences on it, which can only take us so far. We can only overcome our biological drives so much through social pressure, which is what shame is. It's social pressure. So it's kind of like trying to bail water out of a sinking boat with a bucket with holes in it, like a bunch of holes in it. When the bailing becomes exhausting and he becomes tired from resisting his instinctual urges, I won't say natural, but I will say instinctual urges. He becomes exhausted by holding himself back, by not giving in to those urges. If he was operating out of shame, he would likely, in a moment of exhaustion, have acted on his impulses and decided to sexually pursue children. And when he did that, if he were successful in his pursuit, he wouldn't have a reason to stop. Because shame says, I'm bad. So he knows he's bad. He already knew that from before he committed the act. He didn't, but let's say he did. He knew. He knew that it was bad. It's a shameful act. And now he's committed this act that he knows for sure makes him bad. So now if he's done the thing that makes him bad, he knows that he's bad. Why would he not do it again? Why should he stop? If he's already bad, if he's already condemned, if he is already a terrible person because he sexually molested an underage human, why should he stop? If he had shame, just shame about it, it would be a lot more likely that he would fall into the traps of his own desires and pursue them. As wrong as they would be, he would probably do that. And once he did, the first time, there would be no stopping him because there's no reason to. This is why guilt is so useful. And it's why it's a fucking decision. This is why it's a decision. Guilt and shame, they don't enter that way, but we do get a choice. We can choose what our narrative is. We're adults now. We're not children. No, it's not easy. It's extremely difficult. And you're going to have to do it over and over and over again. But this guy seems to have chosen guilt every single day. Not shame, but guilt. Because his own personal values said that this is not okay. That's what guilt is. I know that there were less extreme ways to explain the differences between guilt and shame, but I chose these because these are the most impactful that I could think of. It's my style. So guilt and shame are not the same thing, but they are very similar. They're both emotions. And then the difference between guilt and shame is the value judgment. Are you going to judge yourself, or are you going to judge your behaviors? It never, ever, ever does any good to judge ourselves. It'll never do you, me, or anybody else any good to be shamed. It is a disgusting, deplorable habit. It does no good for anybody. But guilt does. Guilt helps. Because guilt says, this is not in line with my values and my goals and who I see myself to be. And that can stop us from ever doing that again. Whereas, if we mess up something simple, not pedophilia, not even butt sex, but if we mess up something simple and our judgment on ourselves is, I'm a piece of shit for doing that, it takes so long to crawl out of that hole. And I know it's super duper duper easy to fall into that. My God, I fall into it all of the time. I'm such a shame-prone person. And the issue for me with it is, the reason I'm shame-prone is because I'm extremely responsibility-prone, too. I like to take responsibility for things, because if I take responsibility for it, then I can do something about it. And I thought shame allowed me to do that. And deep in my bones, big parts of me still believe that, which is why shame is still a default for me. Not nearly as often, but it's definitely still a default. And so we have to choose. We have to choose every single time. And it is exhausting, but it's the best choice that we can make for ourselves, to choose that we may mess up, but that doesn't mean there's anything wrong with us. It means that we make bad decisions, but we aren't bad people. So I hope that makes sense to you guys. I hope this wasn't too heavy or too crazy for you. Thank you so much for listening and for making it this far. You've made it all the way to the end. I hope that you find some peace in your screw-ups. Lord knows I do it enough. I've been wanting to put this podcast out for weeks. It's been written. Like, I wrote it all out. It's been written for 2 weeks. Still didn't do it. Because I kept wanting to make it perfect, and there was all this stuff, all this pressure, and all this judgment calls I did on myself, and finally was just like, this is why the first ever podcast was done is better than perfect. Because I really wanted this to be a great one. And that expectation made it so much harder to even engage in. These judgment calls make our lives so much harder. So instead of judging yourself, judge your behavior. Go with guilt. All right? Guilt's our friend. Shame's a douche. I love you guys. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. And remember, stay curious and stay uncomfortable.